Listen to the voices of the advocates.
Professor Leslie Thomas KC is an acclaimed human rights and civil liberties barrister in the UK, with expertise in claims against the police and other public authorities, as well as against corporate bodies. He has represented many bereaved families in inquests and public inquiries where there has been an abuse of state or corporate power. Professor Thomas has won numerous awards for his work, including Legal Aid Barrister of the Year in 2012 and 2016. Join Razlan and I as we speak to him about his incredible journey. We are very happy to welcome to Advocates, the podcast, Professor Leslie Thomas QC. Leslie, thank you for being on our show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be invited.
Thank you. So let's get cracking. We normally start with a little bit of your background, your childhood and your family. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm the child of the Windrush generation of immigrants to the United Kingdom. My parents both came from the Caribbean, from different Caribbean islands. My mother from the island of Antigua, my father from the island of Dominica. They met each other in London, in West London, where they fell in love in the mid-60s. They had me, typical Windrush generation. My parents were looking to make a better life for themselves in the, as it was then known, the motherland. I grew up in poverty. We shared one room for the five of us. That's my parents, my brother, and my sister. I'm a middle child. But, you know, despite the fact that we had very little, it was a happy childhood that I remember. And I thank my parents for what they've given me, especially my mother. My mother really drilled a work ethic into me. She was, or I should say she is, she's retired now, but she is one of the most hardworking people I know. She's what I would describe as a finisher. She never likes to see an unfinished task. And that's something that mum has instilled in me.
And was there a great emphasis growing up on doing well at school?
Yes, there was. I mean, say, neither of my parents went to higher education in terms of university. They just didn't have those opportunities. You know, my dad could have gone to university. I have no doubt about that. But when he arrived in the UK, he had to work, and there was a lot of discrimination and racism in those days. And so, you know, somebody of my dad's ability, he was left to doing a lot of manual work, you know, despite the fact that he had the intelligence and the brains to have gone on to university, but he didn't. As for my mum came to this country when she was very young. She was 16 when she arrived. She she had finished her formal education very early, as you can imagine. And despite that, both of them, both parents, knew the value of education to pull an individual out of poverty. And so for my siblings, education was always important. Although my parents couldn't give us the support that, you know, those whose parents have gone on to higher education, university could, they did their best. And I'm very proud of what they did, given their humble roots.
Struck by your journey to law school, and I'd like you to tell us about that, as well as why law.
Okay, so I decided on law. I think I would have been about 13, 14. You see, my school played a big part in this. I went to a state school in the United Kingdom, or certainly in England. We have an unfair education system. We have a private system. Interestingly, we call our private schools public schools, but they're private schools. And we have our state system. And the state system of education at the time, the education providers and policymakers thought it would be a great idea to have comprehensive education whereby you put all students of mixed ability into the same classes. So I went to a comprehensive school. We didn't have streaming. There was no A stream, B stream, or C stream. Everybody was in the same class. It didn't matter what your ability was. And that made me realize just how unfair the system is, because education is very much a lottery. There were some parts of the country which still had the old grammar system, with smaller class sizes. I remember in my school, I'm talking about from the age of 11 to 16, before I took my A levels, our class sizes were huge. We had class sizes for the UK of 35, 36, 37 kids in the class. Whereas, in some private schools, the class sizes can be as small as 10 to 15. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the teacher can only give so much attention to each individual student. And if you have to divide your time amongst so many students, it makes it very important, very difficult to see, whether their children might be struggling. So I realized that our system was not the best or the fairest system that we could have. But despite that, I had some brilliant teachers, some teachers who were able to nurture me, who saw that I had abilities, I had confidence and faith in me, and who encouraged me to do the best I could, despite all the odds. And I say this, when I look to recruit or look for talent, I am impressed by those kids, those young people who've been through a state system and make it despite the odds, because that's saying something, as opposed to children who have had every privilege, every advantage, and who have got through. You would expect them to get through. So my coming back to your question, just putting it in context, my teachers, particularly in classes like sociology, developed critical thinking within me, not to accept the status quo, to ask questions. Why is this that way? Has it always been that way? Who says it should be that way? And that critical thinking made me believe that perhaps the law was something that I could go into. But the real marker for me in relation to why I decided to go into law was being a young man of color growing up in 1980s Britain, and the discrimination that, just being a black boy on the street. I remember realizing when the scales fell from my eyes that it doesn't matter what capabilities you have, what talents you have. The first thing that people will see is the color of your skin. And I realized that when I was a good student, didn't get into trouble, would make my way home from school and cope with life at home. And I was nevertheless stopped by police for no good reason. I was on my way home from school. It was in the afternoon. I was in a school uniform, and the police decided to stop me and search me. I knew then that our system was unfair, because I know that my white peers would never have been treated in that way. And indeed, many of my black peers were treated in the same way that I had been treated. And this has got nothing to do with one's capabilities. It's just to do with how you look. And so from that moment, I thought, you know what I would like to do is do something worthwhile in life to see if I could redress this balance. And to my mind, law was the answer.
And I've read that you got into law school just on an interview, and then ended up, I think, second in your class at the end of your course. I'd like to ask whether you had ever considered being a solicitor rather than being a barrister.
I considered it, I think, probably for about a minute and dismissed the idea.
Tell us why. Tell us why.
Here's the thing. I realised that being a barrister, because in England and Wales, we still have a separated, we don't have attorneys that do everything. I realised that I wanted to be one of those advocates who appeared in court. We still have this archaic system where we still wear white wigs. And the only reason why we wear white wigs is because 17th century fashion. But I realized that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an advocate. And when I researched the difference between solicitors and barristers more, there were a number of things that appealed to me going down the barrister route. Firstly, I could be entirely independent. Like, in other words, I would be self-employed and work for myself. That appealed to me because I didn't want to be in a firm where I had to toe a particular line, which you would have to be. I wanted to start off from the point of running, being my own person. Secondly, back then, when I entered the profession, there was a real distinction between advocates and those who dealt with clients predominantly. Barristers were really seen as the advocates. They still are today, but less so. Today we have solicitor advocates. And so this is a reason which is less so today. But when I entered the profession, if you wanted to be a specialist advocate, be one of those lawyers who appeared in court and argued, it was the barrister route. There weren't as many opportunities for solicitors back then. And that is what appealed to me. I knew that my strength lied in my ability to be articulate and to present a coherent argument, as opposed to, dealing with clients on a day in, day out basis. Not to say there's anything wrong with that. I think it's really important and that needs important skills, but it wasn't for me.
Let's now look at Leslie Thomas. In 1988, you've been called to the bar in Middle Temple.
Inner Temple.
Beg your pardon, Inner Temple. Called to the bar in Inner Temple. The profession is predominantly white. It still is, I'm sure, today. How did you find your way from being called in '88 into a set of commercial chambers for your pupillage?
Have you heard that expression, not to look a gift horse in the mouth?
Yes, yeah.
Well, it was really interesting. The way I got my commercial pupillage is, something I'm not particularly proud of in terms of equal opportunities, because it wasn't very equal opportunities. But the old boy system worked for me. Let me explain. When I did very well at university at Kingston Law School, and my head of law, a fantastic professor, I owe him so much. His name is Robert Upex. He saw promise in me, and he said to me, he knew that I wanted to go to the bar, and he asked me whether I had any connections and whether I had a pupillage. And I said, no, I didn't have a clue, to be quite honest with you, as to what I was going to do. I just knew that was the route I was going to take, and by hook or by crook, that was where I would end up. Robert said to me, Leslie, I have a friend at the bar. His name is David. He will give you a pupillage. I said, what? Everything's sorted. And so I didn't have to go for a pupillage interview. I ended up, because my law professor had a friend from Cambridge, they both went to Cambridge, who was prepared to give me a pupillage on the say-so of this professor of law, who said, you need to take this young man on. This young man is going places. I turned up. It was at 13 King's Bench Walk, my first set of chambers. And this fantastic man, David Richardson, took me under his wing and schooled me and assisted me in becoming a barrister. Basically, he said, "What you learned at your school, we throw out. This is how you do it." And he schooled me in black letter law for 6 months or so, I think, before I had to change and I went to another supervisor. But he was what we describe, he was my pupil master at the time, or supervisor, which is a more modern way of describing it. And he taught me the importance of hard work. He taught me the importance of churning out papers in volume. It was really interesting. When I first started, he would just put a set of pleadings in front of me on a case and say, right, read these and give me an advice. And I would do my best. I would knock out an advice, or I would do a claim or a defense. And as soon as I did it, he would take them, mark it in red ink, and there was red ink all over my work, and then give me another one. And this went on, day after day for 6 months. It was relentless. I was just churning out papers. And I said to David, David, when are we going to go to court? And he said, look, this is the foundation of court. You have to go through this. And he was right. Those early lessons of trying to get the pleadings right, trying to get the advice, that clear thinking, knowing what your strategy was, the corrections that he did on my work was invaluable. It was an invaluable lesson.
And clearly something you've carried into the next part of your career as well. What was it like in those days? I mean, there must have been very few black barristers. What was the atmosphere like in chambers? And how would judges treat you? I mean, you didn't just not look like other barristers, you didn't sound like other barristers.
Well, absolutely. I mean to say that there were a number of differences between me and them. Firstly, I suppose the elephant in the room is I'm black, and, and and they were all white. We didn't have, when I say all white, there was not a another black or brown face in chambers, and so that stood me apart from everybody else. Secondly, there was a real class thing. I was a kid from a humble working class background. Everybody else in this chambers, or the vast majority of people, were from privileged backgrounds. And here's the thing, even if they weren't from privileged backgrounds, they gave the air that they were from privileged backgrounds. People lost their accents. I grew up in South London, and I think at times I still have a little bit of a South London accent.
Yeah, for sure.
That's me. I'm proud of it.
Yeah,
That's part of me. I couldn't quite understand why individuals who were, meant to be independent-minded advocates would want to lose their roots, whether they had a regional accent or whether they had a working class accent. I clung to my accent, and I clung to who I was. So there's that. And then thirdly, there was the fact that I went to a comprehensive. I didn't go to a private school. I didn't go to, most of the people in this set were from Oxford or Cambridge University. I had gone to, Kingston at the time didn't even have university status. It was known as a polytechnic. And so there was that. And so how did all of this pan out? Well, to be honest with you, my supervisor was lovely. He was a fantastic man, and who I was, where I came from, made no difference to him. He treated me with dignity and respect. I can't say the same for some of the others in chambers. And that was an experience that I was going to get in my early career at the bar. I remember dining at the Inner Temple, and It was one I think it was the very first time I dined, and I was sat next to this master, of the Inner Temple, who's a very masters are very senior, lawyers. They're all benchers. They became very known as benchers of the inn. And you can either be a judge or a senior barrister, and you get invited to be a bencher, and one of the leaders of the inn who participate in the running of the inn. And I sat on this table for dining, and I didn't realise, the etiquette. And this bencher said to me, very first question, "Which island are you from?" My response was, "Well, where I come from, the only islands that they have are traffic islands." The second question he asked me was, "Do you like cricket?"
Okay, right.
And I said, "Well, actually, I'm a more of a footballer myself." There wasn't a third question.
Okay, I think we get the picture. Brilliant. Now I want to now pick up on your career just before you joined Wellington Street, and what struck me was that you've got someone who's come up from that sort of that modest background, as you speak of it, comprehensive school, Kingston Law School, and you've now got ahead of you 13 kbw, a career at a commercial bar, which is where you make a lot of money. What made you go to law centers in the evening?
Oh, I felt I was just losing my soul. The work of my supervisor was interesting, brilliant work, but we were just not representing the people that I wanted to represent. Let me tell you something. I had that eureka moment in life where you're doing the wrong thing on one of our cases. My supervisor was representing a very large chemical company. In fact, he did a lot of work for this chemical company. There was a chemical explosion at one of its plants in the north of England, and a young man had died. And there was to be a settlement conference between this young man's widow and her lawyers and my supervisor and the chemical company. And they were going to try to thrash out a settlement for the death of this young man. And, I was invited to this conference, which I went to. And when I walked into this conference, it was held very much on our terms. So at the it was at the base of this chemical company up in the north. So it was in their offices. And the widow turned up with her lawyer, and he wasn't, one of these flash lawyers. He didn't have a flash suit on. He was very modest. He spoke very modestly. He spoke with a regional accent, whereas we had a team of suits who was representing the chemical company. And the negotiations started. And I knew at that point in my own heart, I was on the wrong team. It just felt wrong. And you know what? That lawyer representing the widow earned my respect. He battled hard. He negotiated like a titan for his client. And at the end of the day, I think the settlement conference lasted a good day, actually, with backwards and forwards, with offers being made and counter offers being made. And I even remember saying to my supervisor, "Look, can we do a bit better?" Because I felt really sorry for this widow and the children that the deceased had left behind. But my supervisor was a fair man. He was not the sort of barrister to take advantage. And a fair settlement was made in the end. But I left that meeting with a couple of things in mind. Firstly, the lawyer for the other side earned my respect. And secondly, I knew that this was not what I could do or where my heart was. And so you mentioned that I did a lot of law centre work. That this was how I appeased my soul in the evening. I went around. I knew I had a promising, glittering career ahead of me in commercial law. But I wanted to meet real people. I wanted to hear real problems. That's not to say that corporations don't have real problems, but I wanted to deal with, everyday, ordinary people. And the law centres did that for me. And, you know, they say that things happen for a reason. I was doing the law centre circuit. I was volunteering my time every evening after a really hard day in chambers, and I was doing it 4 nights a week at 4 different law centres around the capital, around London. And these things happen for a reason, because at one of the law centre meetings, I think I was doing some legal letter writing for Liberty, but as it was then known, it was the National Council for Civil Liberties. And I met. They had uh, I think it was near Christmas, and they had a drinks function afterwards, and people were mingling and talking with each other. And this gentleman came up to me and asked me what I was doing. I explained that I was working in this commercial chambers, and he said, what you're doing, what are you doing here? And I told him what I was doing for Liberty, and he thought that was incongruent. He goes, why aren't you in a different set of chambers? And I said, well, I explained how I got my pupillage and how I was grateful for it, and I had this promising career ahead. And he said to me, look, why don't you come to my chambers and meet the people there? Now, I didn't even know who this man was. Turned out that he was Lord Tony Gifford, QC. And he invited me to his chambers. I didn't know, I just thought it was a friendly gesture. But they interviewed me. I didn't even know I was going for an interview. They gave me this interview, and they offered me a tenancy. And I was torn. What do I do? Do I give up life at the commercial bar, or do I run and go to these lawyers who were described? I'd done a little bit of research after they offered me. They were described as radical left-wing lawyers who were taking on the state. And I spoke to my supervisor about it, and he said, Leslie, I'm really concerned about you. You're you've done well. You will do well. You're very bright. You will thrive in this set of chambers. And then there was the offer of Wellington Street. Well, I thought about it for a minute and went to Wellington Street. And I've never looked back.
You spent obviously a few years at Wellington Street doing public law.
No, actually, it was 1 year.
Oh, was it just a 1 year? Oh, before Garden Court?
Yeah, it was 1 year. It was 1989 to 1990.
Right.
It was tragic. Tony Gifford decided to go to Jamaica to do death row cases, and Wellington Street collapsed. And some of us went off and formed what then became Doughty Street Chambers.
Yeah.
A few of us went off, and I went to Garden Court.
Right.
And I thought when Wellington Street collapsed, I thought maybe my supervisor was right. Maybe I should have stayed.
Now, I'm interested. I'm going to ask a couple of questions now. I mean, obviously, Lord Gifford had a massive impact on your career. Turning now to Garden Court, in those early years, who did you learn from?
Courtney Griffiths, QC, and David Watkinson. So Courtney and David are two very different barristers, but two barristers full of generosity. And you know something? One of the things that I try to emanate from these early mentors of mine is the openness and the generosity of spirit. They have what I describe as an abundance mentality as opposed to a scarcity mentality, which I've seen in so many lawyers. And let me explain what I mean by that. Many lawyers work on a zero-sum game, that if if they give you this, if they share their time with you, that's taken away from what they have. If they introduce you to their clients or their solicitors who might instruct you, that will mean that there's less instructions coming to them. And so many lawyers, many barristers, really keep their contacts very close to them and are reluctant to share them because they feel, if I give you some of what I have, that's less for me. I don't share that mentality. Neither did David Watkinson, who was a housing practitioner, nor Courtney Griffiths, who was a criminal practitioner. They had the mentality that I will I will share with you everything that I have, because that can only bring more back to Chambers. If you become good, Chambers becomes good. We all look good. We all benefit from that. And that to my mind has got to be right. And in fact, so you know, David Watkinson, as I said, he was a housing practitioner. He taught me everything he knew about um, housing disrepair, homelessness cases, judicial review, public law, and he didn't need to. He didn't need to. I wasn't a pupil at this stage. I was a young barrister. I was starting in Garden Court, but he wanted to develop the housing team, and I was willing and able. I had a commercial pupillage. I wasn't fearful about doing paperwork, and he taught me everything I need. And in my early years at Garden Court, I did a lot of judicial review. I did a lot of housing law, disrepair, landlord and tenant. On the other hand, there was this battle that was occurring between some of the barristers, because I know that Courtney wanted me to become a really good criminal barrister and be part of the Garden Court criminal team. And so Courtney taught me everything that he knew, and I learned some really important lessons from Courtney. I learned, the importance of your own voice, being true to your roots, not being afraid of who you are. One of the funniest things I ever saw was Courtney was representing, I think it was a gangland type shooting where, one gang had another gang, and the gang that Courtney was representing had a lot of African Caribbean young men in it, and he was representing an African Caribbean man. And it was in the middle of London, and Courtney was addressing the jury in his closing speech, and he just suddenly went into Jamaican patois when he was addressing this jury, and it was the funniest thing I had ever seen. And he had the jury rolling in laughter as he was, doing this Jamaican patois, which is part of Courtney's roots. And his client was acquitted. Up until that point in time, I would never have dreamed that that was either workable or appropriate. But anything's appropriate if you make it your own. And that's what he taught me.
And what about lessons in cross-examination, for example?
What Courtney taught me in terms of cross-examination was how you can make it methodical, and so you don't miss things. So he taught me one skill, which is the power of schedules. And so the way it works is, and I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say you're doing a case, and let's assume it's a criminal case, but this could work with any case. And so what you do is you look for internal and external discrepancies. And the way you do that is, so if on a criminal case, you might have, so that, let's say you've got to cross-examine a police officer or several police officers. And so you know that police officers will probably have produced a notebook. They probably would have produced a witness statement. They probably would have produced what in England and Wales what we could describe as a Section 9 Criminal Law Act statement. So, and there might be an interview, let's say. So you take those 3 or 4 documents and you set it out in a table. So you would have the notebook set out and you divide the notebook into chapters. And so chapter one might be where the officer first meets the defendant. Chapter 2 might be the reasons for the stop. Chapter 3 might be the arrest. Chapter 4 might be what happens at the police station. And you use those chapter heads in relation to each witness statement, and you put them in a table, an Excel table or an Access table, doesn't matter. And so you do the notebook line by line, typing it out. You do the section 9 statement line by line, and you do the interview line by line. And what that document does, you immediately see discrepancies internally with that witness. And it's methodical, but it makes sure that you work on the papers and you don't miss those discrepancies. Then you look for the external discrepancies. So you do the same exercise, but you do it with the different police officers. So you do police officer A, police officer B, police officer C. And so say you do police officer A notebook, police officer B notebook, C notebook, you still look for discrepancies. You do it with their section 9 statements, you do it with their interviews. And you highlight where all the differences are, the significant differences. And it's a fantastic tool for cross-examination.
Right. And do you write down every question that you intend to ask and formulate the words carefully in your mind?
I used to, now I don't. I mean to say, when I first started, that was something that I used to do. I used to, my speeches I used to write out, my opening speeches, my closing speeches I used to write it. Sometimes, I might still do, write out a closing speech, but it won't be word for word like it used to be in the early days. And I used to do that with my questioning. Now what I do is, because I'm more confident and I know that I don't want to be tied to a script and you need a degree of flexibility, particularly if you've got a tricky witness. What I do is I do bullet points, I do themes, and I use the tables that I was just telling you about. I use those as a guide because I know that I've got confidence in myself that I can have a free flowing dynamic cross-examination or questioning of a witness without needing a prop or crutch of everything. I feel confident I can do that. So I'll bullet point the key issues and I'll use the tables that I've described to highlight what the key issues are, so I won't miss them.
In cross-examination, how important is listening?
You cannot cross-examine unless you listen. You see, I've seen so many advocates who, they're not good listeners. In fact, they're not listening, because you'll do a case and you'll see an advocate who has a script and they're working their way through this script and they're not listening to the answers. And they're not listening to the answers because that there are follow-up questions that they should be asking. And they one of the things that we do, I'm an advocacy trainer. And one of the headlines we do when we use the Hempel method of advocacy, which is where you focus on one area that you're trying to improve and a young advocate to develop. And one of the headlines that I use is don't let the witness escape. Right. And so if the witness gives you an open goal, what you can take a shot at, and then you go on to the next question, you don't explore the question or the answer they've just given you, you haven't been listening to what they've said. So it is extremely important to have good ears on you when you are cross-examining. You need good ears. You need to be able to repeat what the witness has said. You need to be able to take it off into different directions. And here's the thing: if you ain't listening, I can guarantee you, judges
Hmm. Hmm. Good point.
or the jury.
Jury. Good point. Now, do you prefer that sort of forensic side of the work, or do you prefer the jury speeches and submissions on appeal?
I hate appeals. Courtney once said to me, the great Courtney Griffiths QC once said, Leslie, I don't have many appeals. That's because I try to get it right first time. And there's something that obviously there are going to be times when you don't have a choice but to appeal.
Yeah.
But there's something in that, in those words of wisdom. Try to get it right if you can. Try to avoid appeal. But the answer to your question is, I think you need strengths in both the forensic analysis and the advocacy and the presentation. And I see myself not as somebody who is particularly skilled or talented in one area. I see myself as an all-rounder.
One thing, because we've done some bit of reading on you actually, and you've had all these big important cases where you particularly take on authorities. I'm just wondering, do you prosecute yourself?
No.
And why is that?
I've never been asked.
Okay, that's a fair answer, I think, Rose.
Look, here's the thing.
To follow up, would you mind prosecuting?
I won't be very good at it because I've never done it in 31 years. and I'm sure that the state would want experienced and skillful prosecutors. Look, this really touches upon the whole nonsense about the cab rank rule. I've never been approached in 31 years of practice to represent the state. Perhaps I'm not good enough. You see, the reality is, I believe, whilst I understand the principle behind the cab rank rule, it's a good principle, but the reality is a fiction, because those of us who represent and do criminal defense and represent victims, if I can use, or alleged victims, I can use that, are hardly ever asked to represent police, prosecute. So it just doesn't happen. And indeed, one of the things is, if you're in a criminal defense set of chambers, the CPS aren't going to go, generally speaking, the CPS aren't going to look to you. That is the reality. I can understand that there are skill sets that you get if you do both. As I said to you, I don't do crime anyway, but let's use an example that in my practice, police actions, would I represent police forces as opposed to claimants bringing claims against police? I have represented police officers on a couple of the cases, but that is where they are claimants bringing actions against their police forces. They have recognized my skill set as being worthy of instruction to take on the police force. Police forces don't instruct me; they don't want to instruct me. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough for them.
Leslie, I'd like to turn now to your work, this sort of the police actions and the inquests. And what I'd like to ask you is, do you have to bring a different set of skill sets to doing inquests and those types of actions rather than traditional court work?
Yeah, you do, definitely. And whether you're representing state agents or whether you're representing the bereaved family, it's a totally different skill set that you bring to an inquest. So, for instance, you need to have empathy. You need to have understanding. You can't and at times even I fall foul of this. right? So I will be doing a cross-examination of a police officer or police witnesses who are accused of killing someone. Now, sometimes that's a very easy task for me because there's a lot of sympathy for the deceased, and particularly where the state agents have really let the police force down in relation to what they were doing or what they should have been doing in terms of following their own protocols, particularly so on restraint cases where they've restrained somebody and the person has died under restraint. But it's very different though, where if you're doing a case whereby the individual who's died is considered to be something of a bad sort. Maybe they were in the middle of a crime and they were shot. And that the jury are going to have a great deal of sympathy with the police who were put into a very difficult situation. Maybe it was a last minute decision that they had to call and they shot somebody dead. And you're nevertheless representing the bereaved's family. You have to handle the sensitivities of that situation very carefully, because you could very much lose your jury if you go in too hard. And in fact, in recent times, I was doing a case and I think I may have gone in too hard and lost a jury because my cross-examination of police witnesses may have been too robust and I called it wrong. And, if you lose a jury, you lose a jury. There's very little you can do to gain your credibility to get that jury back. You'd hope that they're not dealing with it on the personalities of the advocates, that they're dealing with it on the evidence, which is what they should be doing. But hey, we live in the real world.
Yeah.
Judges, jurors, we are all influenced by the advocates who appear in front of us, and to deny that is to deny reality. And all good advocates know how you present. There's a real risk if you're a bit over the top of losing your court, whether that be a judges, tribunal, or jury. So the skill set at an inquest is very different. A lot of empathy. It's not a good look to go in and cross-examine the widow of the bereaved to tears.
Yeah.
Can I give one example that really illustrates the point? There's a very infamous case involving the death of two children, Bobby and Christy Shepherd, who died on a Thomas Cook. Thomas Cook is a big travel company. It was the biggest travel company in Europe and perhaps the second biggest in the world. These two young kids, they were 4 and 6, I believe, 4 and 5, something like that, little mites. They had gone on holiday to Corfu with their father and his partner and died in a bungalow because there was a faulty boiler which gave off carbon monoxide emissions. And their bodies were brought back to the UK and there was an inquest into their death. And the CEO of Thomas Cook, a gentleman known as Mr. Frankhausen, at the time we're doing this, Thomas Cook has gone bankrupt and is no more. But at the time, I think this was 2016. Thomas Cook was, still very strong in terms of their market share value. And I was cross-examining Mr. Frankhausen, the CEO, in relation to the death of these two children. And I said to him, do you have kids yourself? Yes, I do. I said, these two children died on one of your holidays. Now, I fully appreciate you aren't personally responsible for this, but your company is. Would you like to take this opportunity, look my clients in the eye and apologize for their loss? Mr. Thomas, I have nothing to apologize for. This response. At that moment in time, the jury, every member of the jury hated Thomas Cook and everything it stood for. They lost that jury. That jury returned an unlawful killing verdict and held that company responsible for gross negligence, manslaughter of the death of those two children. That weekend, Thomas Cook's share price plummeted. And that is because, they lost the jury, losing the court. And that's a prime example of that.
Brilliant. Raz, you had something.
Yes. Can I just go back to your earlier answer, Leslie, where you said you yourself had experience where you lost the jury? Could I ask, do you have techniques or some internal mechanism yourself where you sort of hold back and then you realize, hang on, Leslie, I'm losing the jury here now? I mean, you're an experienced advocate now. Do you have some tricks of the trade where you can see the jury and say, hang on, perhaps I'm not doing this right?
Yeah. So the one thing you need to do is your position is very important in court. You need to keep an eye on your court, and you need to be able to read body language. When you're cross-examining, the shaking of the head is a pretty good indicator as to whether or not you're doing it right. If you're cross-examining a witness and you've got jurors with their arms up, some jurors cannot help themselves. If they're doing that, you know that you need to adjust. And so one of the tips and tricks of the trade is keep an eye on your jury and be prepared to make adjustments. And those adjustments might be simply just lowering the tone of your voice, softening your tone, being very respectful in the way you address the witness. Remember, you can cross-examine or question robustly, but politely. You don't need to be rude when you're cross-examining. You can be firm, robust, but polite. One technique that's very good for trying to bring things back if all has not been lost is just slowing it down. Slow down because when we speak fast and we get, our pitch goes up, we're more likely to be loud, aggressive, shrill in tone. Slow it down, bring it down a level. Give yourself an opportunity to take things in. I find that works.
Leslie, let me ask you. I just want to touch on one more part of the sort of the higher profile cases that you've done. And I watched your submissions before the Grenfell inquiry, your closing submissions. And can I, just to our listeners, if you have an opportunity to, please jump on the link on Garden Court's website and watch this. It really is eye-opening. My question to you about that submission was that one of the parts of your submission was the effect that color had on this tragedy. And I was struck by the fact that it wasn't part of the terms of reference of the inquiry, race. So were you able to introduce that? And I noticed you introduced that without any intervention from the members of the inquiry because of stature.
Maybe I got away with it because of who I am, but I don't know. That might have played a small part in it. But no, I think the reason why I was able to introduce that is simply because it is the elephant in the room. Even though race is not an issue, not part of the terms of reference, it's something that we cannot ignore. It would be a crime to spend how many years on the Grenfell inquiry and not to examine whether or not race and issues surrounding discrimination played a part. And if you look at those submissions that I was making, they were reasoned, and they were reasoned with statistics. If you look at the 72 people who died in Grenfell that night, 58 of them, or I think it's 58, something similar to that, were people of colour.
Yeah.
How can you ignore that?
Mm.
You know, even if only to examine it, to dismiss it. You know, we notice this and we've examined it because we can't ignore it, but we find race did not play a part. What's wrong with that? But not to go there. And so I think an advocate needs to be brave and do things. You'll notice nobody else did it. Nobody else went there until I went there. Nobody else did. But my team and myself, because it wasn't just me. I've got a team of junior lawyers and fantastic lawyers working with me on Grenfell. We all decided that it was somewhere that we needed to go. We couldn't ignore it.
And it was powerful. Just before we jump to the rapid fire questions, which is where we normally end up, I need to ask you this. Your mother has been a sounding board for you for your cases over the years.
Yes, she has.
So what is the biggest contribution that she's made to a case that you've done?
I think if I can't get an argument past my mum, then I know I'm going to have difficulties getting it past a jury, because my mum is quite conservative in her attitude. That's conservative with a little c. It's one of those advocacy techniques that I recommend most people try. You know, try it on your parents, try it on your partners, try it on your children. If they understand the argument. So you've asked me for a specific example. I remember one time I was doing a compensation case on a police case, so somebody had been wrongfully arrested, and there were difficulties with this case in the fact that my clients had done things wrong. I think they had committed crimes, but they had been abused in the police station, and the only thing that my mum could get in her mind, well, they'd done these crimes, done this, they'd done it, you know. But mum, even though they'd done these crimes, the police can't beat them up in custody. Yeah, but they'd done, and I knew that was going. I knew that if my mum was saying that, that was something I would have to address in terms of the jury.
Interesting. Okay, we turn now to the rapid fire section. First question is, what do you enjoy the most in practice, the intellectual exercise or the interpersonal skills?
I love meeting people, you know, which was, as I said, one of the reasons why I went around law centers. So I think the interpersonal skills, I really enjoy that. I really enjoy helping clients find solutions to problems, because that's what lawyers do. We help clients find solutions to problems.
Second, the opponent you respect the most.
Oh, there's many opponents that I have a lot of respect for. So I don't think there's any one opponent that I mean, say some of the opponents, there's a police actions lawyer, an inquest lawyer that I come up a lot against. His name is Jason Beer of Queen's Counsel. He's extremely good, very bright. There's a barrister called John Beggs, QC. I've done many cases involving John over the years. I've got a lot of respect for him. There's a barrister called Jonathan Hoff, who represents coroners. You know, Jonathan Hoff QC represents coroners all the time in judicial reviews. I've got a lot of respect for him. So I don't think it's one.
Okay. The judge who challenged you the most.
I would say I was doing a police action, and the judge is going to remain nameless.
Yeah, sure.
So it was a county court judge, and he was just intervening all the time with questions. He clearly didn't have any belief in my case, and I had to deal with him and also handle a jury. And I realized that despite all of his challenges and interventions and really pushing me, he lost the jury because they found for me.
Interesting. So up to this point in your career, who's the one person you've learned from the most?
Courtney. Courtney Griffiths,
Okay.
QC.
And if there was a case that you would want to go back and re-argue, what would it be?
Oh my goodness, so many of them. I think recently I did a case just recently, a few weeks ago, an inquest called Andrew Hall, where we didn't get a very good result. It was an inquest of a death of a black man, mixed race man in Bradford. And if I could re-argue that, I would just do it completely differently, because I don't believe that you do things the same, do things the same, get the same results. So I'll do that completely differently in the hope that I'll be able to convince a jury that his death should be looked at in a different way.
Interesting. How do you personally handle losing a case?
Now, I'm philosophical about it. I move on to the next case. In the past, I used to beat myself up and blame myself, but I realize that you can't do that now. I've got enough experience now to know that there are some cases you lose, and there was nothing you were ever going to do to succeed on those cases, and you just have to use them as learning experiences and move on to the next case. So I'm very philosophical about losses. I feel sorry for clients, particularly if they're cases you feel they shouldn't have lost. That's how I handle it.
Okay. What is the single most important quality in an advocate?
I think you need to be a people person. I don't see how you can be an advocate, because the whole point about advocacy is persuasion. How can you persuade if you're not a people person? If you don't like people, you're not going to be able to persuade, because that's going to come across. So I think you need to be a people person.
What does Leslie Thomas QC do to relax?
Several things. I walk. Since the pandemic, I've discovered the joys of walking, and I walk most mornings about 8 to 10 kilometers. Takes me about an hour and 15 minutes, and I might listen to a podcast when I'm walking, or I might just walk I live in beautiful countryside, and I just love walking in nature, so that I walk. I train. I think it's important to keep your body fit and healthy. So I do a lot of exercises, and I play music. I'm a jazz musician. I play tenor saxophone, and I will play mindless scales, practicing scales, or I will compose, or I will, just improvise to play along. So that's how I relax. You need to have something that takes your mind away from the day job.
Yeah. And lastly, on my end, at least, tell us about a day in the life of Leslie Thomas QC at the bar. And in particular, I'm interested in your monkey list.
Okay, so a typical day for me would be I wake up at about 4:30. I do a to-do list in my black book.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Each day. I'm very religious about that, so I'll spend
So can I'll just ask you, you've divided that page into three
columns.
sections, right? Yeah, three columns. Yeah, tell us about that.
So the first column is all the physical things that I need to do. So diet, yoga, exercise, vitamins. So I make sure I write them down, so I tick them off. The middle column is work-related things. So what task I have for that particular day, clearing emails, the monkeys on my back, getting rid of those. So those are the things that are nattering in your ear that you need to get rid of. You just need to deal with them. Otherwise, they will constantly drag you down. And the third column are the things for me, my self-improvement. So it's during the last 6 months, I've been working on various things, improving my Russian, my improvisation in jazz. I've been going back to learning Spanish and French, which I learned earlier on, and just constantly churning those out. And also making sure that I read a particular book a week. So I'm currently reading a book about the Stoics and
Okay, so yeah, so then you do your list, and then how's the rest of your day pan out typically?
So I'll do my list. Then I'll do the training or studying that I have to do, and then I'll get down to work. I normally start work at about 8 o'clock, and I'll do whatever task there is for that day. If I'm in court doesn't normally start until about 9:30. But if I'm not in court and I'm doing advices or reading briefs, that will start at about 8. I'll work from 8 until about 1. Then I'll take a break at 1. In the pandemic, I've been lucky because most of my work's been at home, so I've been able to spend some time with my little one. Sorry if you've heard my little one on this recording screaming in the background.
Oh no, we welcome noises such as that. Yeah.
And then I resume at about 2. I take an hour for lunch, and I'll work typically until about 6, 7. I'll stop at 7. 7 is family time, and I normally go to bed at about 11. So I get about 5 hours sleep a night.
Right. Okay, brilliant. That's a full day. Well, Professor Leslie Thomas QC, again, thank you so much for being on our podcast. That has been a riveting hour and 10 minutes. Thank you for listening to Advocates, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on all our social media channels. Leave a review or share this episode and tag us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.